Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us. And today we're continuing our journey through the Tao Te Ching, and we are currently in chapter 72. So I will share my screen and we'll get started. So today we're working with the Addiss and Lombardo translation, and we'll just jump right in here. When people are not in awe of power, power becomes great. And here we have, again, something that seems a little bit cryptic because it's very minimalistic in the way that it states it. And there's probably a couple of different ways that we could pursue this line of thinking. I'm curious, if you look at this, what do you think is trying to be said here?
My first thought was, wait, that's backwards. But then it occurred to me that great here is maybe not intended to be great in the sense of large or uh, powerful or forceful or that sort of thing, but more great in the sense of good.
Mm,
Like uh, if leaders are not seen as um, uh, well, I guess if leaders are seen as like just another person, someone you can relate to, someone that's like, one of us kind of. So then the more relatable leaders are, the more trustworthy they are, the more they're respected for their human qualities, the the more great in the sense of good, the power of leadership becomes.
hmm hmm Yeah, one thing that is uh, interesting in this particular translation, in the second line, when it says power becomes great, it is not necessarily that it's a wrong translation, but the becomes is an interpretive move. So, in a more like literal sense, it would be great power arrives. And so I think in the way that they're framing it here with becomes, it is lending itself to more of a positive interpretation, much like what Dane was saying, is that um, along the lines of if people are not in awe of power, then that means that something good has it's become something good. Is that fair to say how you to sum that up?
In the sense that people go along with the leader because they choose to, not because they have to.
hmm
Yeah,
Yeah,
to
so
me, it's like if people are not in awe of you and they're still wanting to follow you and respect your leadership choices, then you know that you have like it's the better version of power, I would say, rather than just people like being in awe of your power and that's why they respect you.
hmm hmm Yeah. So I think in spite of its minimalist translation here, it's definitely leading the initial observations to be more on the positive side. Um, if we were going to think of awe in a little bit more in terms of the idea of fear, which is also a legitimate translation of this, and the second line, instead of becomes great, but arrives, so great power arrives, what might be another direction that we could look at this line that might be a little bit more on the negative?
Me, it's saying don't lead through fear, but that isn't really a negative, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, if you
You're
are
a
leading
little,
through fear, that's a negative. Oh, am I
your
maybe
microphone's
it's
a little
not?
quiet.
Okay, 1 second.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jim is like twice as loud as you.
Any thoughts on that, Dane, from more of a
This
negative?
should be better.
Oh, yeah. We can definitely hear you now.
Is it too loud?
Oh, no, you're good.
Okay.
It's good to hear you. Or Chaz, if you have any ideas.
Yeah, my mindset was on the kind of the same route as Dane there, where people are not in awe of power. That means when I say in awe of power, I think it's usually in more of like fear is kind of what comes to mind.
Mhm.
Um, and when people are not afraid of your power, then the power becomes, and I had the same sense of great is not in the sense of the power itself, but in the commonality of great equals good.
In the sense of what kind of power instead of the amount of power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Here's one maybe. If if you're trying to be in a position of power and people are not afraid of you, and like say you're trying to rule through fear or whatever, if people are not afraid of you, then you've got to do stuff to make them be afraid of you.
Mm.
You got if you don't have enough power to instill fear, then you have to accumulate more power in order to instill fear.
Mm. Hmm. That would definitely be a little bit more on the negative side for sure.
Like you have to establish a monopoly of force. If you don't have a monopoly of force, then you have to generate more force until you do have a monopoly.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I've compiled two other translations of these two lines here to show the different directions when this is filled out a little bit more in either of the two directions that we've been discussing. And then also comparing it with some other passages in the Tao Te Ching to help us see how really we could kind of go both directions with this, either with more of a negative bent or a positive bent. I think the balance of the chapter is going to lean us towards more of a negative bent, but see what you think as we go through this. So the second translation that we have here of the same lines, right? If subjects do not fear authority, then great authority has arrived. This would be Chad Hansen. And this would be very much in agreement with what we're saying in terms of the positive interpretation, but it's just kind of spelt out a little bit better, right? So if they're not in fear of the authority, then great authority has arrived in the sense that it's already here, right? And if we look at one of the previous, oops, went too far. Sorry about that. Really went too far. There we go. So in chapter 17, it's been a while since we've been there, but you might recall this chapter, is talking about aspects of rulership. And it's saying that very few are aware of the highest. So at the highest levels of rulership, when they barely know you're there, this is like the best form, right? Then comes that which they know and love. So this would be leaders that they appreciate and they rally around and they're happy to see them. But for the Taoists, this is actually one step down, maybe still on the good side, but it's not as good as somebody who leads in such a way that you're not even aware that they're there. And I don't think they mean like the, dark state type stuff, but in the sense of, that they actually aren't trying to take credit, that they're setting it up for others to succeed and that kind of a thing.
One thing that helps me visualize this actually thinking of just like on a more concrete level, the police. The police have a certain type of power that, and you could say if you apply this to the police, like if you are not even aware of the police existing, you don't even notice them, you're not just aware of the police presence, even though there is one, that's kind of ideal. If it's kind of like the saying I've heard that health is a state of not being aware of your body, because when you're aware of something, it means there's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then the next best would be if the police are known and loved. Like there's this Officer Tommy Norman, guy in Little Rock who's got this big social media presence because he goes out in the community and bonds with people and does all this stuff. He's like a social media celebrity and known and loved in the community. And then the next best would be if, at least if they don't, if they're not loved, if they're at least feared, so that you follow the rules. And then even worse than that would be if they're actually actively despised. That's
Mm-hmm.
kind of, you think of those in relation, just like to have the relationship between the police and the public or civilians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in this chapter 17, then it's kind of creating a ranking order of quality leadership from best to worst, and feared is towards the bottom there. So if we take this thought or context and apply it to that verse, the first one here, that's where we can see more of that positive interpretation that Chad Hansen has. If subjects do not fear authority, that means they're, on the upper end of that scale. Then it means that great authority has arrived, is already there, that this is somebody who's doing a good job. So definitely support for that way of thinking about and translating this passage. Let's look at one other one here. So, if the common people do not hold your authority in awe, then some greater authority is on its way. And this is a bit more ominous, right? This is kind of like where Dane was going when he said, if they don't fear you, you're going to have to amp up the game in order to get people to fear you. If in fact your method of leadership is one that's based on control through fear. So here, it's basically almost like a warning to the leader that says, "Hey, if your
The
people,"
guillotine is coming.
what's that?
The guillotine is coming.
Guillotine is coming, or replacements coming.
Going to be some kind of revolution.
Yeah. So and so there's definitely a way of looking at this then that is much more ominous, all right? Almost like a threat. To if you were to say this to the leader, it's almost like you're failing at your job and you're going to get replaced, you know? And it's interesting if we think about, and it's not discussed a whole lot in the Tao Te Ching, but within the context of the Warring States period, an emerging concept that was becoming really important in Chinese political thinking or philosophical thinking was the mandate of heaven. And this is the idea that who's in power, um, whereas before it was maybe more of a situation where there was like a particular deity that was authorizing power, more along the lines of like we might think about like the divine right of rulership that you would see more like in medieval times, where a king would claim that he had God's authority to rule. Whereas what then starts to happen in the Warring States period is you have this mandate of heaven, which can sound similar. It sounds like, well, heaven is mandating who should rule. But if heaven is becoming more naturalized, as many of these scholars think at this time frame, then it's not so much that there's some type of intention or delegation of leadership. It has more to do with the naturalness of how somebody becomes and maintains themselves as a leader. And the idea is more of, if people are choosing you because you are, in fact, meeting the needs that the community has, that is demonstrating that that ruler has the mandate of heaven. Whereas if the people become unruly, and eventually through either invasion or overthrow, you lose your rulership, that would also be then part of the mandate of heaven, that you were failing at your job and now you've been replaced. But it's seen as much more of a natural process, almost, I wouldn't say democratic, but it's basically if you're not keeping things in harmony, if you are not helping the people to thrive, then it's going to have an inevitable consequence that you're going to fall out of that leadership position. And this is what was happening with the Zhou dynasty when they replaced the Shang dynasty. This is how they explained the replacement, was that there was the mandate of heaven, which was more of this natural transition because the Shang dynasty had failed in its responsibility to the people. So in this sense, then, of seeing there's this responsibility between the two, we can also look at another passage in the Daodejing that would support more of this kind of thinking as well. And so this is back to Addiss and Lombardo. It says, use, and let me explain the square brackets here. So I replaced a couple of words here because in the original translation from Addiss and Lombardo, it says use non-action, which would make you think they're saying wu wei, but that's not actually the phrase underneath it. It is dealing with the non-interference. So use non-interference to win the empire. And here again, this is in brackets because it's the Tianxia, the all under heaven, the social world. So it's really dealing with that empire idea. So use non-interference to win the empire. How do I know this? Like this. The more prohibitions and rules, the poor, I think that's supposed to be the poorer, the people become. And so this is going to lead to, in a sense, kind of this idea that there's going to be a revolt, that people are going to stop paying attention, that they're stop, being respecting your authority in that sense. So again, we can see a way in which these opening lines can be read in more of that negative sense, kind of a threatening sense to the political leader. So let's see how this unfolds, because I think we'll see that it actually leans a little bit more towards that negative interpretation. Although I would say that the vast majority of the translations I consulted lean towards more of the positive interpretation. But let's see how the chapter unfolds, and you can let me know what you think. So it continues then by saying, do not intrude into their homes. Do not make their lives weary. If you do not weary them, they will not become wary of you. So it's, in a sense, kind of this non-interference type of an idea, that the more you kind of pile up rules and regulations, or you're thinking about taxing or interfering with aspects of how they live, the more they're going to not be happy with who you are, right? So we definitely see a little bit of a concern, especially with that last line, that sounds like it's more of that ominous kind of direction. It's suggesting that the proper way to be engaged in this political situation is, again, not to intrude into their homes, do not make their lives weary. If you don't worry them, they're not going to worry you or become wary of you. So maybe we'll pause for a moment and see what some of your thoughts are on this.
This doesn't seem all that mysterious. Maybe one of the least mysterious passages. It's kind of like, duh.
Well, maybe in terms of like the opening passage, following it with this, how do you relate this back to the opening lines? Do you see that supporting more of a positive interpretation or a negative interpretation?
Seems to me
Do you
to be
mean,
more the positive direction.
So connect the dots. How do these two fit together with the positive interpretation?
Well, not intruding in people's homes, in people's lives, seems to line up with the sort of invisible ruler concept.
Yeah, it's definitely promoting that invisible ruler, to use your phrase. But the second half of this then becomes a little bit of a warning, doesn't it?
if well, if if the first half had the more dark interpretation, like keep your subjects afraid, otherwise either they're going to rise up or you're going to be invaded, then then this could be interpreted as suggesting, well, so you better intrude into their homes and make their lives weary, otherwise you're going to get voted off the island.
Yeah.
But this it seems like that seems more of an artificial, like a forced interpretation. This seems to just naturally be suggesting. I mean, it says do not do this and do not do this, and if you don't weary them, they won't become weary of you. Therefore, they won't want to rise up and overthrow. Or if somebody invades, they'll want to defend because they'll want to keep you in power.
Mm-hmm.
So that just seems to be the more natural interpretation of this part.
Mm-hmm.
And
Taylor.
also not the thing about the small fish, don't poke it too much. Seems
Yeah.
to line up too.
Yeah. Cooking a small fish, definitely the idea of non-interference, letting things be. Yeah. Taylor, you were going to say something?
Oh, I had a question on your question.
Oh,
So
yeah.
it's not relevant now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so it's a text that is really opening itself up to some different ways of looking at this. So if the opening line is more on the positive side, then this would be the first two lines here are essentially reinforcing that, right? So if they're not in fear of you, that's a good thing. And it's because maybe you're following the advice of not intruding into their homes and not making their lives weary. If it's on the negative side, then we have a situation that's a little bit more nuanced in the sense of the, let's say, popular or not popular is not the right word, but more of the underlying way that it has typically been looked at from a rulership perspective is one in which you need to have people fear you in order to be an effective leader. And if they don't properly fear you, you have to be concerned because they might replace you with somebody else, meaning like the higher ups, right? So in the Warring States period, you've got, different states that are vying for power. But if we think about the larger empire view, it's much more kind of hierarchical, in which in the Zhou dynasty, you had like the emperor that delegated power to these different states, which have now started to fight against each other. But in that arrangement where the empire is overseeing these states, then those states have a responsibility to keep their people in line, so to speak. And if they didn't, there was the possibility of being replaced. So if the background idea is that conventional, let's put it that way, conventional knowledge is that you need to rule through force, you need to be the strongest, you need to be the most powerful, so people don't dare to disobey, then if you're failing in that regard in terms of generating enough fear, then you're in danger of being replaced. If that's what that opening statement is saying, then what follows is how to do things different. It's kind of a turning it on its head. Instead of thinking that you need to rule by power, you need to think about rulership as ruling by non-interference. And what does that look like? It looks like not intruding into their homes, not make their lives weary, right? And if you do that, then you're not going to weary the people and you're not going to have to deal with the idea of disruption or revolt or not following what they're supposed to be doing. So there's kind of this would then be not a continuation of that first line in the sense of the first opening statement being negative. It would be a challenge from the Taoist perspective to reverse that way of thinking, that fear is not the way to do rulership, because that generates people who are dissatisfied. Not
So
as,
to thinking this way, this is the consequence, and here, think this way instead.
excuse me, swallowed funny. Yeah, it's it's a little bit more, excuse me, something to drink real quick. It's a little bit more of a nuanced way of trying to look at what's being said in the text, where there's the conventional wisdom that you're supposed to rule through force. And the concern for the rulers during that time frame is if they don't succeed in doing that, they're in danger of being replaced. Then what this is suggesting is, in typical Taoist fashion, a reversal of that thought, that instead of trying to rule by force, instead you want to rule by non-interference. And in doing so, you're going to create people who actually enjoy having you as a ruler, as opposed to fear having you as a ruler, which ultimately is a better outcome. So another piece of this that may be coming into play is when we're thinking about the overall concern from a philosophical, especially a political philosophical position, is the primary emphasis is always at this social level. There's individuals obviously that are involved, but individuals are part of that social system. So they don't really speak to, here's what individuals should do, but here's the way we need to think about things in order for society to work harmoniously. And you've got various traditions that are arguing about what is the best way. So the Confucians are definitely much more traditional in the sense of, there is a way that we've always done this, and it's based on a hierarchy, and that hierarchy is maintained when people recognize what their rights are and their responsibilities to, those above them as well as those below, and so forth. And the Taoists are really challenging that quite a bit by suggesting that when you try to force people into this more unnatural pattern, there's going to be resistance because people don't like to be put in those boxes. So the other, so we have that reason for pushing for more of that non-interference approach. But the other thing that's interesting that I've been learning more about in terms of when the focus is on this social way of organizing society, the concern with the philosophy is not as much about how do we have more of an accurate reflection in our language of what the world actually is, as much as concerns about how do we talk about the world in such a way that it's going to produce the type of social behavior that we want. And a consequence of that is a lot of the rules were a bit more arbitrary and maybe not that easy to determine ahead of time. It wasn't like they had specific or clear ways of defining what your responsibilities were in the society. And because of that, everybody was always somewhat on edge because they didn't know if what they were going to do was going to upset those who were in charge and bring about consequences. So here it's suggesting, again, more of that hands-off approach, but also it could be starting to touch on this idea of being more clear about what things are going to generate positive outcomes socially. And this is where the Taoists are saying this language thing, how we're trying to use a different Tao for how we get people to act socially is going to have different consequences that when it's based off of this language, which is going to be somewhat arbitrary, it leads to a great deal of ambiguity. So there's more of a focus on this hands off and a less of a focus on using specific language to guide action and focusing more on looking at these natural patterns as a way to think about how to do things. So here, they're again suggesting that those patterns would suggest that when things are not interfered with, when they're allowed to be of themselves, they flourish in more of an appropriate way, as opposed to when you over involve or interfere, then it works against you. And I know there's a lot of different like lines of thought there, but maybe the core thing is, you might remember that story we told from Mencius about the guy who was trying to raise or grow the wheat, and he thought it wasn't doing it right. So he went out to kind of tug on it to see if he could help it out. And he ends up like wiping out his crop. It's that kind of an idea, that where you have more of this conventional way of thinking, there's this idea that you have to intervene, you have to do something, otherwise it's not going to work out right. And in doing so, you end up messing it up. You're pulling on your plants, trying to help them grow. And so the Taoists are saying that doesn't work. You got to reverse this, turn it around.
So you've got to push your plants down.
Yeah, it makes them strong.
Yeah. Well, not the reversal at that point, but the reversal of the idea of thinking that you have to do something to help them. But what's interesting is there are things you can do, right? But they're more contextual. It's more like making sure they have enough water if that's a type of plant that needs to be watered, or making sure they're protected from predators or something like that, right? So there's like contextual things that you do to help the natural process to do what it's going to naturally do.
That's the whole concept of permaculture, is that instead of creating an artificial kind of situation to propagate one particular species, instead you sort of you design an ecosystem of multiple species and help them to flourish in a natural way, the way that natural ecosystems do.
Yeah. And it's interesting if we take this into thinking even about our current political context, at great risk right now, given how heated that debate is, but just in more of a general idea. Um, a lot of the concerns have to do with things like how much are we being taxed? How much is the government interfering or trying to dictate certain things, or the where the different levels of engagement are happening. And so we see there's still that issue. We could even think about it in terms of in more of the workplace type questions, where there's, post pandemic, a lot of people got used to this idea and really appreciated the idea of working from home, but then the businesses have more of a desire sometimes to get people back in the office for various reasons. And so you have, again, this question of, control versus more hands off, and how do these things work? It's very interesting that we continue to wrestle with these same ideas of, do we do better as a people when there's less regulation and we're allowed to have the government function more in terms of creating the context in which things can naturally flourish, versus trying to have too much of a heavy hand. And I'm not saying this to make direct connections to either of the political parties, but more in the sense of, these are questions that we still wrestle with and are still important in how we think about our daily lives. Any other thoughts on this section before we go to the conclusion? All right. And how does this thing end? Therefore, the sage has self-knowledge without self-display, self-love without personal pride. So if we look at the contrast that's being made here, we're again dealing with the question of the outward show of something. And I like Dane's phrase of invisible leader. If we apply that to the sage, or even the sage king, here we have a similar type of a thing where it's not about the outward show in terms of the display, but it's more about the inward cultivation that has a role in terms of how the social part of it happens. And a big way that all the political schools thought about it was that people learn by imitation. And we've seen some of this come up before where we've talked about how, we mimic our parents initially and we learn how to speak. We learn what actions are appropriate or not appropriate. And so we start to collect all this social information that the Taoists are leery of, because this then is starting to form and shape a particular way of being as opposed to maybe what's a little bit more natural, where they go back to this idea of, can you be like a newborn infant? Not in terms of being infantile, but not being encumbered with all these social ways of defining things. Now, it'd be interesting to have more of a modern discussion with these ancient, sages, because there really isn't a way to participate in any type of collective activity without some type of shared story or shared identity or shared way of thinking about things. But I think they're not necessarily saying that there shouldn't be any story, so to speak, but that we need to be constantly aware that there is a story there and that story is not necessarily based in objective reality, but it's something that we have socially constructed, and therefore it needs to be subject to regular evaluation, right? So here, the idea is that the sage or the king is going to be an example to the people. And if they are modeling things in a certain way, there's going to be this mimicking or this mirroring of that's going to ripple down through the different segments of society in terms of how people are going to interact with each other. And so the sage is saying then, if the goal is this non-interference, then even at the sage level, it's kind of a similar thing where it's not about this outward display or this way of trying to get people to see what they're about. It's more of they have done the inward work and there's more of this natural outflow just because of who they are without having to make a point about it. And I'll be curious your thoughts on this idea of mimicking or how leaders have an impact on society in terms of how society acts. Do you think that is a legitimate way of looking at it, or do you think that this is maybe out in left field? What do you think?
I think we've seen this happen in our lifetime. We've seen leadership act a certain way and people follow. I'm just going to leave it at that. I don't want to make it political.
The behavior of the leaders gives permission for what type of behavior is okay or acceptable. And I'll name one example because it's far enough in the past that hopefully there's not a lot of charge around it still. But under the second Bush administration, Bush Jr., there was criminal activity going on at the top, and there was also criminal activity flourishing in the form of a lot of predatory lending practices, which ended up. There was, and I was actually involved in the real estate business at this particular time and had firsthand experience of this. That there was a lot of fraudulent activity going on in the lending sphere where people were appraisals were being inflated. There were no down, zero down mortgages, and what ended up happening as a result of that was it kept on going. It went on for a couple of years until the housing market crashed. But by then, the fraudulent mortgages had been tied into the stock market through derivative swaps and whatnot, and that caused the U.S. stock market to crash, and that caused the global economic contraction, one of the largest that we've lived through. And uh, I remember thinking at the time about how a passage in the Tao Te Ching about how like when the leaders are criminals, criminal behavior will flourish. And there were like so many instances of this going on that like the FBI could prosecute like hundreds of cases, but there were like thousands of cases happening. You know, there's no way for uh for it to be reined in because it was just so prevalent. And I remember thinking at the time that this is something that the Daodejing talked about.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting in a couple of different levels. One, there does seem to be something to the effect that those who are held up by society, how there is like a value in what they do and a way that people try to be like them. As much as we might think that seems kind of silly, it is something that actually happens. We tend to be like those that we care about and that we appreciate or that we aspire to be like. And so there is something to those who are in those positions. What is their character like? The other thing that's interesting from more of the Chinese philosophy question is, do we get into specific rules versus talking about more of a story in a sense of how we think about who we are as a people? And the distinction would be, if we're talking about a story or a way of talking about things, there's an example that we try to live up to. The question with that then becomes, well, whose story and who says so and why? And so there's bickering about that, or there can be if you don't fully enforce it. The Confucian version is much more about, the story and how do we enforce it, which is why a lot of the political system tended to gravitate towards more of a Confucian view. The Taoists really questioned a lot of how that story could be accurate because there's lots of different ways you could interpret it, and everything seems to be reversible in a sense. And so the one of the responses to this was what they called more the legalist movement, where they tried to come up with more specific laws that had more of an independent way of justifying why they should exist. That is based, again, trying to be based more on, let's say, nature. And the response to that was that if you have a king that's making decisions based on, let's say, utility, what's going to bring the greater good versus harm, that the problem you have is if people then mimic that they themselves are also going to be asking the question, what's going to bring me better benefit versus harm? And you're going to have everybody trying to optimize for self. And that it's going to create a bunch of people trying to seek their own self-interest. So it's another kind of form of mimicry where if at the highest levels, they're trying to demonstrate how they do things according to, let's say, utility, then it's going to produce people that are trying to maximize benefit through utility. And I think that's where you see a lot of people trying to game the system, or how do they take advantage of the loopholes and so forth. Whereas if you have more of this story or this narrative that defines the kind of people, then you have people trying to align with the story. But the challenge with that is that, well, whose story and why? So the Taoists find themselves in a very interesting place trying to navigate through these different things, presenting something even different yet, where it's more of not necessarily about the language or the story as much as it is about the observation of going back to these patterns. How do things actually function in the world, and can that serve as a guide? It's not that we have a definitive answer on this either, but it's an interesting additional approach that is taken in terms of how do they solve some of these social problems.
I think that mimicry is probably a factor, but you don't really even need mimicry so much as just permissioning. Like if it's okay for the leaders to do this, if they can get away with it, then it's okay for me to do this, right? It's not that people are, even if people aren't like admiring the leaders or wanting to be like them, it's they're still it's just kind of like a setting of standards of what's acceptable that that leads certain types of behaviors to flourish.
And that's the
Yeah,
question again about those standards or those laws in a sense of how do those get used and what's the justification behind them that then is what's getting mimicked in the one way of thinking, right? Yeah. Taylor, you're gonna say?
I was gonna just say, like, you always hear the phrase like lead by example or things like that. And I think like kind of what Dane was talking about, if the leader is doing things and they're getting away with it, then the people start to do those things and maybe they don't get away with it. And then all of a sudden they're more angry at the people that are punishing them, and it's creating like a divide uh, in the system, um, that makes it really hard to have a peaceful, and we'll call it empire, whatever it is, a community, uh, just because this one leader is leading by example and creating a bunch of bad examples for
Mm-hmm.
the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a bit of a conundrum.
Yeah, I like that the Daodejing kind of points out that there's a balance here and that it's not exactly easy, but it is important.
So the final part of this then says that the sage rejects one and accepts the other. So if we go back to the beginning, if if that is on the negative side, suggesting that conventional wisdom is you rule through fear and you even have your own fear because if you're not successful, then you're going to get replaced. Then the Taoist response to that conventional idea is that you actually want to rule through non-interference by not in meddling with the people and letting them kind of self-flourish, and that the sage himself then is kind of taking the same action where he's self-cultivating but not outwardly trying to do this as a display. Then the rejects one and accepts the other would be rejecting that thought that it needs to be ruled through fear and accepts the other, which is ruled through non-interference. If we go with the more positive interpretation of that opening line, that the sage or that the ruler has not instilled fear in the people, and therefore it's a good thing, and that it goes on to give examples of that then in terms of not interfering with people's lives, and so they're not um, engaging in rebellion, then it says again the sage is reinforcing the same idea that they have self-cultivated without the public aspect. The last line becomes a little bit trickier then because the rejects one and accepts the other still falls into that same idea that they're rejecting that idea of fear and accepting the one that they've presented. But I think it's a little bit less of a clear contrast. And this is, I would say, the why I tend to favor the second way of interpreting that opening line in terms of more of the negative, because then I think it gives a stronger contrast with the balance of the chapter in terms of what the opposite is, in terms of the non-interference, which then ties into this final line about rejecting that opening statement, but then accepting the following statement. But it very legitimately can go in either direction. It's interesting to wrestle with the ideas. Any final thoughts on this then before we bring it to a close?
I'm not sure how directly related this is to this passage, but uh, I was just recently watching a video on Arrow's impossibility theorem about how democracy is mathematically impossible because uh, at least if you there are five kind of common sense, straightforward properties. I put the link to the video in the chat that a voting system needs to have. Like if the majority of people want something, then that's what's going to be decided on, and so forth. And it turns out that if there's more than three options or candidates, that you can't. It's mathematically impossible to meet all five of these common sense properties of a voting system, and basically it in any situation where you have more than two alternatives, like a three-party or multi-party system, it kind of mathematically gets forced to a two-party system and kind of um, degenerates into a two-party system. Um, and and I think one fundamental characteristic of democracy or any kind of voting system is that you have uh, well, see, ranked voting, that watch the video. It talks about that.
Was this the Vsauce video?
Veritas, I think
Veritas. Yeah, yeah.
Veritas. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that one, yeah, that was fantastic because it definitely scrambled my brain a bit in terms of thinking about that ranked choice voting, which I thought also, Taylor, was a good way to address that.
Yeah, it ranked choice voting, basically, if you have more than two options, it kind of leads to a two-party system, even if it starts out as it sort of defaults to a two-party system. But one like fundamental assumption is that you have certain people who want to be leaders or rulers or whatever, and then people choose among them. And I think that's like a fundamental problem is that the people who want to be in charge are the ones who should not be in charge. And so what you really need is to figure out some way to like randomly select somebody who does not want to be president, yet is still qualified and will do a good job, and somehow like compel them to do that. If you could get around the idea of like, all these different people vying for this position for their personal motivations, whatever, and you could like choose somebody who doesn't want to be the leader, but somehow like force them to be the leader, but still have them, be somebody who will be qualified and do a good job. But I don't know any good way to do that either. So it's an open question, I guess.
Yeah, democracy definitely has
But
some.
it seems to me a Taoist idea that I'm not sure I could point to a specific passage, but it seems to kind of be an undertone here that the people who most want to be in charge are the ones who are least qualified or something like that.
Mm. Well, yeah, it's very interesting challenges. And I think this gives us some good food for thought. What it means is still an open question in terms of where we go with it, but it definitely, I think, adds a lot to our thinking about and discussions about political philosophy as well as personal.
One thing about this work is if you read it and it seems like it has an obvious, straightforward interpretation, you're almost surely missing the deeper layers.
Mm. Yeah, it's a good point. All right, guys. Well, I want to thank you for joining today. And if you've been watching this as a video and you would like to be a part of the live discussion, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you will get a weekly email with our latest video, as well as links to this live Zoom discussion that happens on Friday mornings. Or if you happen to be in the Southern California area, you can join us in person on Sundays. And we'll see you all next time.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.